What a warm, generous introduction, Shark, and you and Audrey are bedrock for us at ICIC, and we are just so thrilled to, first of all, have old friends and board members here, but also I love how many people. Is this your first forum? This is what we believe is the kind of UN General Assembly of inner city economic development. You know, this is where we get all the real passionate people together and talk about ways forward for addressing those parts of our country that actually are in the greatest economic need, but which, if they can succeed, will be, in a sense, our greatest economic drivers. And I am just thrilled to be able to be here today and to be participating very substantively in this first session on anchor institutions. This is an area that we have long been interested in the inner city because anchor institutions, including hospitals, universities, colleges, and others, are literally locked into inner cities. I mean, these organizations are not going anywhere. The question is, how can we take advantage of their presence, their resources, and their influence to be a major catalytic force in inner city economic development. And indeed, we believe they are one of the most profound catalytic forces that we have to tap into. The ICIC did some work on this topic about a decade ago, sponsored by CEOs for Cities. We'll mention that again in a minute. But we felt that it was high time to renew and rethink this work and see what had happened over that decade. And we had a remarkable opportunity because we started a dialogue with the Cleveland Clinic. Many of you know the Cleveland Clinic is a profoundly competitive, world-class health delivery organization, but it's located smack dab in the inner city of Cleveland. Cleveland is a very, very economically underperforming inner city. And the Cleveland Clinic was interested in how to think about this problem and about how to step up its game. And I don't see Dr. Stallion. He's in the back. He's getting out of the view here. But Dr. Tony Stallion, who you'll hear from later, has been our discussion partner on a really very deep study with the clinic, and that study has motivated us to broaden the work and to prepare the work that I'm going to show you today. But again, the spirit of the forum is ICIC doesn't have all the answers. We think we have some answers. We think we have some ways of thinking. Our team has done an enormously, I think, excellent project here. But the purpose of this session this morning, this whole morning, is actually to have a dialogue with all of you about this topic, because we have many of you in this room that are also experts on this topic. And the purpose of the forum is to bring together thinking and catalyze further thinking, and specifically to try to come up with more actionable steps that then can be spread to cities across America. Almost every major city has anchor institutions. Almost every major city, however, could energize those anchor institutions, and the anchor institutions themselves could, through their activities, we think, make a tremendous difference. So the hope is that this meeting will just add tremendous push to this whole idea that we can transform the role of anchors and how they operate, and in the process create something called shared value. I'm going to talk a lot today about how do you create shared value? How does an organization compete and improve its competitiveness in a way that also benefits the communities in which it's operating? You know, how can we think about creating shared value? Not just value for the organization, but value for the community at the same time. And this notion of shared value, I think, is like incredibly important at this moment in history. Because I think so many people are believing today that businesses and private sector organizations are succeeding at the expense of the community, not in addition to the community or together with the community. And so I think we have a moment here where, although we're going to be talking about anchor institutions today, this issue of how business in general and the private sector in general can create shared value is, I think, a fundamental transformation in management thinking that will take place over the coming few years. So I hope that for those of you that are not running anchor institutions, as I'm talking, you'll think about your own business, your own company, and how it can create more shared value in the process of doing business. I have here a fairly extensive presentation. It's got a lot of stuff on it. I'm not going to try to cover every word of every slide. These slides will be made available to all of you. They're going to be accessible instantly. And so we'd like you to take more time and look at them later. We'd love comments. We'd love input. We'd love pushback. We love things that we didn't look at as I go through this presentation. But I think I'm going to try to tell a story here, which I think is an important story, and a story that if we can refine and develop our thinking about this story, we will have an enormous impact. And probably of all the single things that we could do, this is probably our biggest opportunity for impact, just because of the sheer weight of these institutions in American inner cities. So again, the framing here, I think, is something that may be familiar to all of you. As I said earlier, in 2001, supported by CEO for Cities, ICIC put out a framework focused on colleges and universities. We noted that there were many colleges and universities, including the University of Chicago, located in inner cities. How could those colleges and universities have a bigger impact on the community around them? Because the health of that community around them was so obviously important to the colleges and universities in terms of attracting students, in terms of their reputation, in terms of their image, their brand, their ability to hire great workers. So we put this work out. We were fortunate that this work did achieve quite a bit of resonance out there in the community. Indeed, a number of colleges and universities have kind of used this framework and adapted this framework and improved their impact on their surrounding community. But over the years, we came to believe that we needed a broader approach that not only looked at colleges and universities, which are major anchors, but also started to pick off some of the other types of anchors that exist. And notably, in this study, we focused on health delivery organizations, which are, as we'll see later, the single largest employer in inner cities. So here we, with the help of Cleveland Clinic, were able to really deeply examine those anchors and then integrate that into a sort of an overarching overall framework, which we think we can also apply to other anchors like cultural institutions, sports institutions, and a variety of others, which I think all will operate and be guided by some of the same principles. We find, despite the potential and despite the fact that some anchors have really moved aggressively in this area, and I'll talk about a few of them, we believe that this area is still in the infancy in terms of moving forward. Very few anchors have truly approached this subject strategically. We have lots of what we would call isolated effort, well-intentioned, in some cases quite effective effort, but it's isolated, it's fragmented. And the real opportunity here is to sort of see this more holistically, see it more strategically, and then see it more in this win-win shared value context. I think a lot of anchors today are looking at their community with concern about being perceived as a good citizen. A lot of this activity is being motivated almost more defensively. You know, what do I need to do out of obligation, rather than what could I actually do to create shared value here? What could I do that would actually drive the institution to be more competitive and effective itself? And that's really the spirit with which we have been looking at this subject. So we've conducted some new research, and you can see some of the steps we took. We added hospitals and health systems. We took advantage of the Cleveland Clinic relationship, and of course, we will discuss some of this new research in this session. And then, of course, after the presentation, after a short break, we'll have a panel and bring together some real experts on anchors, and we'll kind of talk about what could be improved, what's right, what's wrong, what are some of the practical applications of this. What are some of our key findings? Well, first, inner cities still need us to be focused on them. Inner cities still continue to lag. The rest of the economy, both on social and economic performance, will summarize that. Anchor institutions and their communities depend on each other. They are inextricably tied. The health of one affects the health of the other. The health of the other affects the health of one. And therefore, they are the imperative for this strategy is not about moral imperative. It's really about institutional imperative and community imperative. Number three, anchor institutions are indeed major economic forces. And we've been able now to much better document just how major they are and what some of the levers are for economic revitalization. Number four, there are still too few examples of anchor institutions that have clear strategies, as I mentioned earlier. Number five, we have updated a framework that we think is more comprehensive and more rigorous and more nuanced and more actionable with which to look at an anchor's community impact. And finally, we have scoured America looking for best practices, and there are quite a few emerging best practices that if we can synthesize and catalog them and communicate them and disseminate them and refine them, we actually have a very clear path forward in many, many of the dimensions of how anchors can make an impact. So that's kind of overarching framework. We're going to talk first of all about the imperative of inner city economic development very briefly. Why should we be worried about this? Number two, anchor institutions and their potential. What levers do they have? Number three, how do we harness that potential with a strategic framework? Number four, how do we actually apply the framework in terms of principles and best practices? Number five, how do we implement this? And what are some of the obstacles? Why don't all anchors already do this? What's been the problem? What's been holding them back? And then we'll talk a little bit about some next steps. So all of you here, many of you here probably know some of this material in the first section of the presentation, but since there's a lot of newer folks here that have not had a lot of relationship with the ICSC before, we need to make a few kind of basic definitional comments, and then we can talk a little bit about inner cities as sort of a foundation for what we're talking about. Inner cities we define as economically disadvantaged communities in urban areas. And the definition of inner cities the technical definition is shown here on this slide. They are census tracts in urban areas with either a poverty rate of 20% or higher, or which meet two of three other criteria, all of which are designed to really capture economic underperformance. These are the parts of an urban area that are underperforming economically, measured in terms of poverty, unemployment, and household income. We have been tracking inner cities now for about 15 years, and we have very in-depth data, in particular on the 100 largest inner cities in America, which we'll be talking about as we go. We'll have a better picture of Cleveland later, but one of the reasons that the Cleveland Clinic is interested in this topic is that Cleveland has a substantial inner city. The yellow shaded area on that map is all defined as inner city in terms of its economic performance. Cleveland has a serious problem. The suburbs are doing okay, but the inner city is economically underperforming. Inner cities are a fundamental problem in terms of the performance of the overall U.S. economy. Indeed, they're the single biggest part of the problem in the U.S. economy. They're very tiny in terms of land. They account for 8% of all U.S. population in economically distressed urban communities, but they account for almost 20% of all poverty in America, and almost 33%, or almost a third, of all minority poverty in America. So if we're going to move the needle on economic inequality in America, this is the epicenter. This is where there's concentrated economic disadvantage. There's lots of economic disadvantage spread around in rural areas and other parts of our community. We have to worry about those too. But the reason the ICC has been so passionate about this topic is this chart. We have to move this needle. Much of the other economic distress is very dispersed. It's very hard to find. It's very hard to impact. Whereas here we have economic underperformance that is concentrated and hopefully, therefore, ought to be susceptible to some more focused strategic interventions. So that's what we are focusing on in the ICC and in this study. This slide just gives you some key facts about inner cities that are, not a surprise. There's 21 million people, and we have Cleveland statistics on the right-hand side just to show that Cleveland is indeed has a serious inner city issue. We have inner cities have lower than average high school education, lower than average college attainment. We don't have overall U.S. data yet, but in terms of issues like health, inner cities have significant deficits. We have good data for Cleveland. You can see that the obesity rate is somewhat higher, diabetes is somewhat higher, heart disease is somewhat higher. Part of the issue in Cleveland is actually the entire region is not particularly economically successful. So the differences between the inner city and the rest of the region would be quite a bit higher in other parts of America. And of course we see the economic statistics in terms of income, ownership of homes, poverty rates, and so forth. This is where we have to move the needle. We have to move the needle on economic opportunity. We have to move the needle on health. We have to move the needle on education. We have to move the needle on all the kind of things that matter for citizens. And the question, of course, is how to do that. Now, in terms of some other key facts, I already mentioned inner cities reflect about 8% of the U.S. workforce. The rest of the central city is 15% of the workforce, and then the rest of the U.S., which would be the region and the rural areas, would be 77% of the U.S. workforce. Inner city performance has been disappointing in terms of job growth. The inner city is the red bar. You can see over the last decade, inner cities have just eked out a tiny increase in job growth, and of course it was all lost, in this last downturn. You can see that they've been very flat. The rest of the city has done okay, and the rest of the region has done better, although not stunningly well. And the challenge then is that in the areas with the greatest economic need, the generation of jobs has been the slowest. And what we'll see later is if it were not for anchors, this would be negative. Inner cities would have shrunk in terms of job growth, and we have some data on that later. In terms of the composition of employment, private employment in inner cities, anchors represent 11% of all inner city employment. Large businesses, the Chevrons of this world, although I'm not sure if they're located in an inner city or not in terms of their headquarters, but large businesses like Chevron account for 17%. But you can see that the great majority is in medium and small businesses, with small business, of course, being the largest proportion. But one of the interesting things, if we go back to this slide, is kind of focus on the small businesses side and the medium businesses side. What we find in inner cities is that there are growing, successful small and medium-sized businesses. By and large, the very large companies have had sort of a declining or stable position in the inner city areas. But small and medium-sized companies, in some cases, are very successful. Many of you know that we have a program at ICC called the Inner City 100. We look all across America every year to identify the most rapidly growing companies based in these economically underperforming inner city regions, and we find a lot of them. And these are just some statistics about the Inner City 100. And these 100 firms that we've identified, spread across America, themselves created 71,000 new jobs over the last 15 years. And we also know that if we can build small and medium-sized companies actually based in inner cities, they employ a disproportionate proportion of residents of the community. So if we're going to try to generate job growth, we find that the small business, and particularly the growing small business segment of the employer population becomes really, really critical. And these businesses actually, some of the characteristics of them, as many of you know well, but they represent, I think, a real sign of what could happen if we can kind of get all the pieces together. And of course, the rest of this day and the rest of the forum is about this as well. But I just wanted to highlight that when we think about anchors and what anchors should do, we've got to get anchors to think about these small businesses and what role and influence they can have on these small businesses, and how anchors can actually be part of the solution of turning these small businesses into growing small businesses. And it turns out that anchors have unusual amounts of leverage in order to do that. It's not easy, but it can be done. Okay, so let's talk about anchors. I'll go quickly here because I'm concerned about time. The bottom line here is anchors are really important in inner cities. There's 925 colleges and universities in economically distressed urban areas. They're located right in those areas. And there's 1,400 hospitals, or 450 hospitals, 350, I'm sorry, the blue line, 350 hospitals located right in the economically distressed urban areas. In the rest of the city, we add another substantial component. And often in the rest of the city is very near, physically near, the inner city. So we can even add those first two columns up to get sort of the total numbers here. We've never really done the math on this before, but it's remarkable that there's so many of these institutions actually located in economically disadvantaged areas, and very much rooted there in every sense of the term. Physically, facilities, history, assets, and so forth. These organizations spend gobs of money. These inner city and rest of city organizations spend gobs of money on their employees, and they spend gobs of money on goods and services. And this just gives you some of the key statistics. We estimate that anchor institutions in the form of colleges and hospitals spend over $200 billion a year on these things. And if we add the urban anchors, it gets even higher, and you can see the number. If we could just move 5% of this procurement spend towards local, towards the community, it would be another one of those things like Mary Kay's earlier statistic about, just create one job that would actually really, really move the needle. And actually, we should do those calculations because you can sort of do an estimate of if you spend that much, how much multiplier effects will you get. And we will do that as this work proceeds. In terms of the employment impact and job growth, you can see that these anchors in universities and hospitals represent about 11% of all the jobs in inner city areas, and actually added 137,000 jobs over this 10-year period. And as I said earlier, without anchors, these communities would have lost 11,000 jobs rather than added, around 100,000. And anchors are the top employers in 66 of the 100 inner cities, top inner cities in America. So again, this is just more weight to what we, I think, all intuitively know, but now we have the data. Anchors are also in the clusters in the economy that are the very large clusters for inner cities, and also the ones that are projected to grow. So you can see that local health services represents the single largest job concentration in inner cities of any cluster. by far. But look at also education and knowledge creation, very substantial. Business services, which we're talking about later, very substantial. Local community and civic organizations, very substantial. But in terms of private sector, kind of business-oriented employment, we see how important these clusters are. And these percentages are estimated percent job growth. And of course, what we don't have on this slide is all the other parts of the economy. And if we had all the other parts of the economy, it would look low in terms of job growth. So these areas are relatively rapidly growing. So anchors are going to have more opportunity than most businesses to actually deploy and think about their hiring and about their procurement as they continue to grow their businesses. In terms of the jobs in anchors, we've done a fair amount of work getting at the question of how accessible are those jobs. When we think of hospitals, everybody thinks of doctors. And, not a lot of inner city residents are going to, get a medical degree, hopefully more. And this is something that Tony Stallion has a personal passion in. And we got to do everything we can there. But that's not going to work for most inner city residents. What's interesting is just how many of the jobs in these anchors do not require advanced training. But they can be very good jobs even with simply an associate degree. And you see the statistics here. I won't report them. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't try to equip residents of inner cities for the highest skilled jobs. What I'm saying, though, is that we have an opportunity today to get more inner city residents into very accessible jobs if we can do a better job of figuring out how to do that from a strategy and program point of view. And of course, inner cities have massive amounts of real estate and do a tremendous amount of building. We haven't been able to pull together all the data on that, but they are some of the major constructors of real estate on the planet, and certainly on the planet US. And if we can get some of that real estate investment refocused in thinking about dual use, how can we create real estate initiatives in the anchors that will also have these kind of spillover opportunities for the surrounding community? We have a real lever on our hands. And there's some people in this room who do that for a living. And they've done it really well. And we have some great examples of that has enormous impact on the community. So the question then is, if we have the need in the inner city, and if we have the resources and potential on the part of the anchor, how do we create a strategy that will actually drive greater improvement in the surrounding communities? And of course, that is the key question, and the question that we've been thinking a lot about. In order to develop that strategy, I think the starting point is we got to have the right mindset. And the mindset we believe that any anchor must use is the mindset of shared value. How does the anchor depend on the community doing well? And how does the community depend on the anchor doing well? And how can we increase the shared value? How can we not try to do everything? Not try to solve every social problem, not try to meet every community need, not try to pursue every local program, but how can we focus on the sweet spot where there's this intersection, this deep intersection of needs, where the anchor really needs the community to be successful to drive its growth and success as an organization, but the community desperately needs the anchor to be successful in order to provide its growth and vitality. Now, in order to think about shared value, we're going to have to shift the mindsets. This is not representative of all anchors, and I'm not singling out anybody here, but our perception has been that anchors have sort of thought of their communities as a social responsibility problem. How can we be more socially responsible? We have a moral obligation as an organization to do something. We've got to placate the critics. This stuff, this work on the community is separate from our core business. And we have a department that does it, and that's what they do. And then we run the business, sort of like we always have. This stuff, this community stuff, is extra cost. We have to spend more to do this. And we have to figure out, we don't have a lot of cost and life is tough, so we got to really squeeze down on the budget for this stuff to make sure that we don't get out of line. And then finally, when we think about our community impact, most anchors do calculations of their overall economic impact. They do these economic impact reports. But what they don't really measure is how they actually connect and influence the real areas of greatest need for the local communities. It's more of a macro sense that look at all the money we're spending, let's look at all this good stuff we're doing, rather than how much impact are we really having. Obviously, we think the shared value perspective says that something very different. It says community, it should say viability, not visibility. Community viability is a critical driver of long-term success of any anchor. An anchor cannot succeed in a failed community. It can't find the employees it needs. It's going to have a hard time attracting the various stakeholders to want to play and want to live there. Creating shared value and addressing the community has got to be seen as an integral component of the strategy, where investments will not just be cost, but they'll actually lead to an ROI in terms of the organization's long-term success. And we have to learn to measure impact of what we're doing on some of the critical areas in the local community business environment that really affect the anchor's ability to grow its own business. This is a very different mindset. We're finding a few anchors have sort of started to see it differently. But the overwhelming majority really are still back on the left. This is something we're doing to be a good citizen, because we have to, because people don't like us. We have to shift that mindset. That is really the starting point for any strategy. Until we shift that mindset, we'll not have a strategy. We can't have one. We won't be successful. That would be our conclusion from the work that we've done. The best single example of an organization that has actually embraced this thinking is the University of Pennsylvania. It's a very famous case. We're proud that we picked it up in our original study 10 years ago and really celebrated it. And now that more time has passed, we see even more evidence of the tremendous transformational impact that the University of Pennsylvania's strategic approach to its community has had. And I won't read all the words here, but I think it's just a fascinating story, and it shows what one institution can do if it views its role as a catalytic and strategic to address the surrounding neighborhood and affect every aspect of it in a positive way. This slide, again, I won't read this, talks about kind of what's the shared value here. What's the shared value? And of course, there's been a transformational impact on retail activity, availability of goods, real estate values, quality housing options, K through 12 schools, safety, local investment by other private sector organizations. The community has benefited dramatically, but almost every single one of those things is very beneficial to the University of Pennsylvania and its students and its faculty and to its ability to find vendors and employees for the university. So this is a classic case in shared value. This isn't charity. It's not philanthropy. It's not doing good. It's not about, this is my day to be a good citizen. This is about thinking, where's the shared value? Where's the shared value? Is this shared value worth investing in? You bet. Is this a cost? No, it's an investment. And I think the University of Pennsylvania is a phenomenal example. But there's not enough University of Pennsylvanias. That's why we're here. We're finding some potential University of Pennsylvanias bubbling up, very few, very few. They're more isolated initiatives, not really a more comprehensive approach that would lead to such a substantial impact that would have the greatest mutual benefit. And so the question is, how can we create more University of Pennsylvanias? How can we create more Cleveland clinics, we hope, as we look at the future here, that will take this approach to the next level. Now, the other thing we would say is that when we think about the local community, there's a distinction that you're all aware of that is, that we have to talk about. And that is, do we care about diversity or do we care about local, about our surrounding community? And what I will tell you is that if you look at most anchor programs in this space, most of the programs today are really focused on diversity. Minority hiring, minority business development, et cetera. Okay? That's good. That's good. We want more diversity. I want to be absolutely clear about that. We want that. That's good. What we're saying is we got to add one more dimension. We've also got to worry about local. We also have to worry about those surrounding communities that are economically disadvantaged. And by the way, if we worry about those surrounding communities that are economically disadvantaged, we're also going to massively impact diversity because the overlap is very high. But what would be a mistake, we believe, is for an anchor to think only about diversity and too narrowly about diversity. And the reason is some of the statistics we have here on the bottom. Of all minority business enterprises, 4 of 5 are not based in economically disadvantaged communities. Do they deserve support and help? Of course. But what we know is that minority business enterprises in economically disadvantaged communities are disproportionately likely to hire people from the community, whereas minority business enterprises outside of the communities are less likely to hire. So the point is we've got to do both. That's what we're saying. And it's been a stretch for some anchors to think local. That's kind of been a new idea, and we want to make sure that thinking local is really a critical part of our strategic thinking if we're going to have the greatest impact. Now, obviously, the ICC is like, we wake up every day thinking about these economically disadvantaged local communities. So you would expect me to say this. But I also think it's really important conceptually for us to understand how we deal with people and place. And what we've got to do is we've got to deal with both. Rather than just one of those two. Okay, so what is this strategic framework? Those of you that have read our earlier work will recognize that this is certainly a cousin, maybe even a first cousin of the earlier work that we did. But we believe that there's 7 fundamental roles of an anchor in community revitalization, both economic and social. So let's talk about those. The first role has to do with actually rethinking the anchor's product, its core product. In the case of a university, that's education. In the case of a hospital, it's healthcare. Role number 1 is my product actually responsive to the needs of my surrounding community? And in the case of a university, that means, do we have educational programs that are really accessible? Are we using our core skill as a university to train people in a way that will actually benefit the local community? If we're a hospital, are we thinking about how to provide the kind of health care that our surrounding community needs? And of course, given the health deficits in inner cities, this is an interesting and profound challenge for a hospital. Because most hospitals have thought, about serving very different kinds of customers. And what we're seeing is that if you can actually think about serving those disadvantaged customers in those surrounding communities, you get to be a better hospital. It's not just about, again, being a good citizen and doing philanthropy. It's about how to raise your game as a hospital so you can do better preventative care, so you can do lots of things better as an institution. So the core product is where this all starts. Making sure your core product fits. That if it's an arts organization, it would be the same thing. Making sure that your core product is actually relevant and benefits the surrounding community. Second, real estate developer. That's pretty obvious. Using real estate development to anchor local economic growth, not just to see it narrowly within the institution's own parameters. Purchaser. Directing more purchasing towards local businesses where you'll get these spillover effects. And by the way, local businesses are local, so guess what? They're close. It means you can have a close relationship, logistical costs are low, you don't have to ship goods and have carbon emissions as you're shipping stuff, across the country. So local is good in terms of purchasing. If you can find capable local suppliers, you'd rather purchase locally. But what we find is that the procurement programs really haven't put much of a tilt on the local dimension, or haven't put enough of a tilt on the local dimension. Employer, that's obvious. Offering employment opportunities to local residents who don't have to commute, local residents who live near their jobs, local residents who are committed to their neighborhoods, and to the neighborhood in which the hospital or the university is based. Workforce developer. Taking responsibility for building the pool of potential employees with the skills that are needed in your institution. What are you hiring? What are your employment needs? And are you doing anything to ensure that there's a pipeline of potential employees? Not across the whole economy. No, you can't take responsibility for every kind of workforce development, but you can certainly take responsibility for workforce development that's most directly connected to the anchor's needs. Cluster anchor. Cluster anchor is, fueling talent, capital, and related businesses into the community. What's a cluster? Whoops, this slide, this didn't quite make it. Well, let me do the last one, and then I'll show you a cluster in a minute. And the final role is community infrastructure builder. We believe that anchors have to take some responsibility in collaboration with others for some of the basic infrastructure in the community. This is public education, this is physical infrastructure, certain other kinds of infrastructure that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, in terms of cluster development, what is a cluster? What we find is that in economies, you have the greatest success where you can aggregate and agglomerate businesses in the same field in a given geographic location. This is an example of a cluster in construction, housing, and real estate. It's not just the people that build the housing, it's the people that develop it, it's the people that own it, it's the people that make the equipment, it's the contractors, it's the brokers, it's the property managers. That's a cluster. And every anchor is part of a cluster. In the case of a hospital, it's the local health cluster. In the case of the university, it's what we call the education and knowledge creation cluster. And what this role says is, look, don't just think only about your own organization. Think about the cluster. Because if you have a well-developed cluster, if you have service providers, if you have the right vendors there, if you have the right kind of programs, that's going to benefit you just like it'll benefit the other companies and institutions in the area. So that's what cluster anchor means. For 4 of these roles, core product, real estate, purchaser, and employer, we believe that the anchor's role is very direct. That is, you have direct control as an anchor. You can decide how to modify your product. You can decide who to buy. You can decide what to build. You can decide who to employ. For workforce developer and cluster anchor, it's not the same. You've got to think about that differently. There, you're not directing it. You're leading it. You're trying to catalyze. You're trying to get others to collaborate with you in this agenda. And then, the green for community infrastructure. These are the more framework conditions. This is more the stuff, the broad stuff, that affects pretty much every business in the region. There, really, you're not going to lead it. You're not going to do it yourself. You're not going to lead it because you're just one of many organizations. There, you've got to be a collaborator that brings together lots of stakeholders. So what this slide tries to get at is in playing each of these roles, one has to have a different mindset about how to actually do it, about how to implement it, about what your role is. And the common mistake that anchors make is that they take on too much. They try to lead too much. They try to direct too much, rather than understand the power of collaboration. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about sort of how these pieces fit together. So clearly these are all distinct roles. But what you see is these roles kind of accumulate. They accumulate. If you have good community infrastructure, that helps you improve your workforce development system. That helps enable the cluster and so on. If you have good workforce development, it's easier to hire the right people. So there's kind of a synergy, if you will, across these areas. And we have to learn to harness that synergy, capture that synergy, if we're going to be ultimately successful. So let's talk a little bit about how we would apply this. Well, first of all, there's some strategic principles. One is, this is a unifying approach. We have to see it as a unifying approach. Each role is valuable in its own right. It can create shared value. If we hire more people from the local community, we benefit ourselves, hopefully, by getting great employees. We benefit the local community, and so on and so on. But efforts in all areas are simultaneously important because they're synergistic. If we do a good job on workforce development, we'll be able to hire better people. If we do a good job on cluster building, we'll be able to find more suppliers, and so on. Each anchor needs to develop a unique strategy. There's no cookbook here. Because each community is different, each anchor is different, it's buying different things, it's hiring different people, it has a different strategic mission, it's facing a different set of community challenges. So like any strategy problem, this is a problem where you have to look at your unique situation and come up with your best approach, but given the fundamental principles. And in order to do this, senior management needs to set some clear goals and monitor progress. We found that too often what anchors are doing is they're measuring inputs, not outputs. How much did we give? How much did we spend? How many volunteers did we deploy? And what we really care about is, what did we accomplish? How much did the needle actually move? And we've got later in the presentation, hopefully, some metrics that are just a first cut at what are some of the metrics that we would measure if we wanted to see how well we were doing in each of those roles. Now, again, the Cleveland Clinic is a wonderful case that has really deeply informed our work. Again, this gives you a little bit better picture of the Cleveland inner city, and those red dots are Cleveland Clinic locations, major locations. Several of them are hospitals. And you can see, that major part of the Cleveland Clinic's locations are literally smack dab in the inner city. So this is a big deal for the Cleveland Clinic. How do we deal with the opportunity to create shared value here? And Tony Stallion has been leading this effort. We'll hear from him later. It's kind of a great case study that we have drawn on a lot. So I'm going to now show you a few slides that really cover the details of really how do we approach each of these roles. How do we approach these roles? What we've been doing now is doing lots of interviews, talking to people, having workshops, and we think we've learned a fair amount about how to think about each of the roles and what some of the best practices are. So in the case of core product, this slide really focuses on hospitals and some of the ways they need to think about being a health enhancer in their community, given the different needs and circumstances of the inner city communities. Their health problems, their access to health services, their access to preventative services. And the Cleveland Clinic has done a lot of deep thinking about how it can deliver those services better, doing what it does best, healthcare, but doing it in a way that really connects with the local community. We don't have a slide in here on universities, but it would be the same kind of thinking. What we've done in this presentation, and I won't have time to go through all of these, is give you 2 or 3 best practice examples in each area. In Cleveland Clinic, they've done tremendous work, for example, on tobacco cessation. And this just talks about some of the success there. Henry Ford in Detroit is really well known in terms of the success they've had on chronic disease prevention and screening for at-risk populations. Again, the populations in the inner city tend to be high smokers and high risk for chronic diseases of various sorts. And so these are just two best practice examples. Turning to the real estate developer role, again, the pattern is the same, and I won't try to cover all these points. Here's the kind of what you need to do to be a good real estate developer and create shared value. You need to think about your real estate not just simply narrowly in the institutions inside, but also in terms of where are those connections, where are those leverage points, where's that shared value opportunity that would actually benefit us. And here are some of the critical steps that we see as we look at the most successful organizations that do this. And once again, we provide some best practice examples, in this case, University of Cincinnati and Syracuse, both of whom have made a really major impact on the community and on its economic health through the way they've leveraged their real estate activities quite effectively. Purchasing, again, I won't go through the details. Set the right goals, monitor your spending, identify local suppliers. There's good techniques for doing that. Unbundle large contracts. Work on growing the capacity of suppliers, often with partners. These are some of the key principles here. Again, Penn was just marvelous at this. Penn spends now $100 million, or 12% of all of its procurement, in the local community. That's the highest number we've ever seen of a major anchor. And the way they've done that is a comprehensive approach that actually ticks a number of the boxes on that earlier slide. Henry Ford is also, we find, a leader in purchasing. They actually pay local vendors a month in advance, not drag out their invoices. And they found that that just allowed those local vendors to grow faster because they're not scraping for, with their credit card balance, trying to finance their receivables. Employer best practices in terms of principles of what do you do. Examples: Hopkins, Brigham, Henry Ford. Workforce developer, kind of strategic principles of how to do that well, and then some best practice examples. It's interesting how the great hospital systems understand how important this is, because remember, about 2/3 of all the jobs in a hospital do not require an advanced degree. There's a tremendous need for employees. And the more local, the better, because they don't have to commute, and there's lots of good reasons to want to have those employees locally. And the really good hospital systems have found ways to build career ladders, stimulate internal promotion and retention programs, collect better data, project the job needs, make sure that those job needs are trained for in the local workforce development community. And these are some wonderful examples of that. Cluster anchor. Again, how do we build the whole cluster, not just think narrowly about us? Because the better the cluster, the more productive we'll be. The more we'll be able to be more competitive. Again, some excellent examples at Wayne State and the Pittsburgh Coalition. And this is incubators. This is support programs for smaller and emerging businesses and others. Community infrastructure, this is in a way the hardest, because community infrastructure is broad things: education, job training, crime, safety, housing, nutrition, social services. There, I think what an anchor has to do is figure out which of those areas should it participate in. And once again, the principle should be shared value. Can't take on everything, but as an anchor of our type, what are those things where there's mutuality, because that will allow us to sustain our involvement and to allocate resources and feel good about it, and not feel like we're just taking money away from from other things. And so here it's a question of being focused and also being collaborative. Never doing these kind of things by yourself. It's great to have somebody adopt a school, but adopting one school in one institution is just a drop in the bucket. What if we had 20 employers come together to adopt 30 schools in a collaborative program? That's the mindset that we have to take on these kind of activities. Okay, well, I'm running out of time, so we'll wrap up here quickly. Again, some best practices, Yale, University of Pittsburgh, and Henry Ford. These are just some of the key metrics that you can measure in each area to see how well you're doing. We've found very few anchors that measure any of these things. Not because they don't care, not because they don't want to, but they just haven't thought of it this way. And we kind of haven't had this shared value, strategic perspective. We tended to have too many isolated programs doing too many things usually, and not being focused. So what's the untapped potential? I've really covered most of these points. We can do better. That's the bottom line of this slide. What are the obstacles? Mindset. Not understanding the leverage that an anchor has in this area. Viewing their involvement in the community too narrowly. Not collaborating very well with other organizations. Not kind of understanding that if the anchor can mobilize a bunch of other organizations, boy, the impact is going to be lots greater than if they try to do it themselves. I mean, we're a university, we're a hospital, we don't know how to do all this stuff. How do we get the right team together to do it? And I think this area of collaboration is getting easier, not harder. I think more governments and more NGOs today understand that they want to collaborate with the private sector, that that's a good thing. There used to be kind of tension and warfare, but I think that hopefully is transforming. And then some kind of key next steps. We try to articulate a few of the principles for leaders of various stakeholders in the city. And again, I won't go through these, but again, we're trying to understand what it takes for a given organization to actually move the needle in its city in this agenda, and we're learning. So what are we planning to do with this work? First of all, we're planning to learn and listen. And the panel this morning will be step one in that process. Number two, we're planning to disseminate this work very, very broadly and find all the other organizations in America that are working on this too and join them. We intend to do a better job of kind of benchmarking, dividing benchmarking metrics and trying to collect data so that we have more evidence of what various organizations are doing. We want to collaborate with cities and with anchors because the more we work with individual organizations like the Cleveland Clinic, the more we learn, the more we can move the needle, and we want to obviously continue the research. So with that, I would thank you for your attention. This is a lot of stuff to absorb in 45 minutes or a little bit more. But hopefully it gives you a sort of a framework, a big picture. Now, after a short break, what we can do then is bring our panel together and actually talk about the nitty-gritty. Who's doing it? How do you do it? What are some of the things that we haven't covered? What are some of the areas that are controversial? So let me turn it over to Deb, and you can tell us what to do.